Today's episode of the Counselling Tutor Podcast is sponsored by Web Healer. You're a counsellor in private practice and you need a website, or you've got an existing website which you need help with. Web Healer are offering Counselling Tutor Podcast listeners, that's you, £100 off the cost of a website design and build. Now, Web Healers specialise in websites for counsellors and psychotherapists. It's what they do. And the Web Healer team provide a completely non-technical, done-for-you solution, leaving you to focus your time on your clients. Operating for 20 years, Web Healer are a trusted resource amongst counsellors when it comes to getting your practice online. So get the package details and claim your £100 off coupon for your new website by going to counsellingtutor.com/website. That's counsellingtutor.com/website.
Hello and welcome to episode 341 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. I'm Rory, and today we welcome Dr. Joe Griffin, Senior Lecturer at the Matonia Institute, a Research Fellow at the University of Birmingham, and author of the book Day by Day, Emotional Wellbeing in Parents of Disabled Children. We also welcome back Ellie Finch, an accredited counsellor, supervisor and social worker specialising in supporting children and parents. Today, they will join me to discuss a lecture they have delivered for the Counsellor CPD Library titled Working with Parents of Children with Disabilities, Complex Medical Conditions and Special Educational Needs. As I will share in this interview, this subject resonates deeply with both myself and my family, as I'm sure it will for a lot of those listening. So with that said, let's roll the intro.
Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for counsellors, psychotherapists, and counselling students. Here are your hosts, Rory Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hello and a very warm welcome to episode 341 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Both my colleague Rory Oakes and myself, Ken Kelly, are delighted to share with you 3 stops on our journey today, starting with ethical, sustainable practice, where we're delving into the world of everyday trauma, a guide for counsellors. We then go into practice matters. Rory's already beautifully introduced that Ellie Finch and Joe Griffin have done a lecture for us in the CPD library, and the interview is about working with the parents of children with disabilities or complex medical conditions. So make sure you stick around for that. And then into student services, recognizing you students on your formal journey. And today, what happens and how do you handle not getting the progression that you are looking for? Maybe going for a course and getting a rejection on that course. So we're going to be delving deep into that. But starting us off, Rory, a beautiful topic, something that we see all the time and I think is underrated, and that's everyday trauma.
Yes, Everyday Trauma. Now, it's the title of a book by Dr. Tracy Shores, and she's an American neuroscientist, and she's written a wonderful little book called Everyday Trauma. And she cites in the research that she used to underpin the book, story of a couple, man and a woman, who were involved in a serious multiple collision on the freeway. They call them the freeways in America. We would call them the motorways. And it was over 100 vehicles involved. It was a massive crash. And they witnessed a very horrific event, which I won't go into because it might trigger some people listening. But suffice it to say, in the weeks that followed, both of the occupants, the man and the woman, both struggled with flashbacks, with anxiety, with stress, all the things that you would look at in terms of what is called post-traumatic stress disorder, but we will refer to as post-traumatic stress. We don't like disorders on the podcast. Post-traumatic stress. But something remarkable happened as time moved on. the man showed less symptoms of stress, post-traumatic stress. Yet his wife was so badly affected by it that she had to sell her business and go into therapy, and she had, by all accounts, a very bad time. And it kind of shows something that isn't often discussed in the world of trauma, and that's the difference between stress and trauma. So we can have stressful events in our life which can have a big impact on us. However, what they don't lead to post-traumatic stress, and post-traumatic stress is the inability to cope. That's the real thing. And I think it's beautifully summed up by Judith Herman, who said, that trauma is not defined by the event itself, but by a subjective experience of it. Everyday trauma can therefore be understood through its impact, not its intensity. And I think that's really important for therapists to understand, because traditionally we've always thought of post-traumatic stress as massive events that happen, such as wars, abuse, childhood experiences. Fact of the matter is they can be a cumulative response to someone going through just a very bad period of their life, Ken.
Yeah, very, very much so. And it's interesting, isn't it, that we're seeing trauma present all the time. And I guess if we look in our own lives, and this is a great place to start, is with that personal development. We look at our own relationship and our own past and what creates stress and distress within us from a traumatic link from our own past, and we're going to be delving into some areas here, relational and attachment trauma, but I wanted to dig straight into education-based trauma because I experienced it myself. I'm dyslexic, neurodivergent. That wasn't seen when I was at school. It wasn't understood when I was at school. Therefore, I was labeled lazy. I wasn't trying hard enough. These are the messages that were coming to me, and I really was trying. And I look back at the time, it just felt stressful, and I didn't like school, and I had an adversity to that. But now looking back, I notice that I have trauma responses to that, and it affects me as an adult. And an example of that would be, just the process of going for a job interview, where you might be asked to fill out a form before going in. When they give me that form to fill in, because of my dyslexia, I have a trauma response where I start sweating, I start shaking, and I have an inability to present myself as, in a calm and measured way, because I had difficulties at school and what came at me there. So it's basically a here and now reaction to a there and then traumatic occurrence that I still carry with me. And despite all the personal development work that I've done as a counselor and therapist and looking at self, it's pretty difficult to shift. It's still there at some levels. So that's educational-based trauma. I'm reading it out from the handout that you've made for us. That's being ignored, humiliated, or punished unfairly by teachers, academic shaming or systematic learning differences not being recognized, bullying in school, and the impact of that is the shame, fear, failure, low self-esteem, social anxiety, and those words, shame, fear of failure, low self-esteem, social anxiety. When I went into counseling training, I went in thinking they're not going to accept me. I won't get in because I didn't do well at school and I wasn't a good student. They're not going to accept me. And that was the message I went in with. I was very grateful to have you as my tutor, Rory, where you couldn't have welcomed me more. But that's maybe an example that some might be able to relate to in terms of everyday trauma.
Yeah, absolutely, Ken. And one of the reasons I became a teacher, I can remember going to do an A-level in psychology in my 30s and at a local further education college. I won't name any names, although I'm very tempted to. The person doesn't live in the UK anymore. But the teacher held up my assignment and said, I just don't understand this. This is totally, what was the word totally incomprehensible, she said, in front of the class. And this was in the 2000s. And I remember going away absolutely crushed. I sat in my car in tears. And it took me another good 3 years to have another go. And this time I went into the right room. I went into the counselling tutoring room, and the world changed. So that's a really good example, Ken, and one I think it's a shared experience that both ourselves have. The other thing is things like emotionally unavailable, inconsistent or critical caregivers, parents, or the people who care for us. That can impact on us and our ability to cope. As can something called triangulation within families. It's an interesting word, isn't it? Whereas you may get, two children in a family. One is treated very well and is the golden child, and the other isn't. And, what I'm trying to get across here is the cumulative effects. It's not just one event. It's a cumulative effect of low level, not a massive event, but just a regular event of being maybe excluded or shamed or told you're a failure. And, it's certainly things like in workplaces, such as, toxic environments, job insecurity, unfair dismissal. All these things lead to everyday trauma. And the thing is, Ken, is that sometimes it can slide past us as therapists. So a client talks about this, and because we may still have in our mind trauma with the big T, it slides past us, and we don't probably exercise the same amount of curiosity or engage with it as we would if it was trauma with a big T.
Yeah, very much so. And it's as impactful. It's as impactful as the trauma with the big T, Rory. So we've covered kind of the relational and attachment trauma within the family and the early development years. We've looked at education-based trauma. You've just touched then also on workplace and institutional trauma. Now, you can definitely gain trauma from your workplace bullying, all of that. And the impact of that is burnout, depression, imposter syndrome. So this is what we might be seeing as counselors, somebody coming in and saying, I'm burnt out in my job. I'm imposter syndrome. So it's common presentations, and there can be underlying trauma. And this is why we're having this discussion at Counselling Tutor. We train trauma-informed practice on how to work with trauma. You can get all the information of our courses. Just go to counsellingtutor.com, click on our products tab. It's all there. But it's important to be able to first identify and then be able to recognize that there may be a trauma base to this. And then the next step is being able to work with that with the client. And it's tricky work, as I say, with all the personal development I've done, I still have my trauma responses that are deep inside me, and they are usually the things that show themselves before my critical thinking kicks in, and I can, it's very primitive brain, those trauma reactions. You don't think it and feel it, you feel it instantly. It's just there. You're in that moment instantly. You're taken back to a time that is not now, and it is a special kind of work. There is, of course, medical and health related trauma. And I think many might be able to relate to that either with themselves or within their families. It's a very, it's a hard traumatic time, and that can lead to hypervigilance, health anxiety, mistrust of authorities, like you can't trust the doctors, you can't trust the hospital, whatever that may be. And then something, and I'm sure, again, so many can relate to, and that is trauma from poverty and insecurity, housing instability, food instability, living in an unsafe neighborhood. These are what we can view as maybe a stressful situation, but they can lead to trauma, and that trauma being present in someone, maybe it was 3 years ago and they're now in a different part of their life, but they still have the fears around that. It's a chronic stress, survival-based coping strategies, even when it's not warranted, trauma around money. And I actually can relate to that as well. There were times of I guess, tough times in my life, and relationship with money is difficult to rewrite. It's a very interesting topic. Everyday discrimination and oppression as a neurodivergent, happily and proudly neurodivergent autistic person. I relate back to trauma that comes from not being seen, not being recognized, my way of thinking and learning not being seen. And that is really, it's discrimination and oppression over years and years, decades and decades of my life. Impact, internalized oppressions, chronic vigilance, emotional exhaustion, all comes from that. It's a weighty topic, Rory.
It is, and of course we've not even covered ongoing experiences of racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, or having to hide your identity. Masking neurodivergence is something that I think a lot of us who are neurodivergent do mask, and that creates a lot of stress, which could go on to lead to an inability to cope. And I think it's really useful at this point to pause and say that one of the things that would impact a trauma response is the fact that events can rewire our brains. Our brains, we talk of neuroplasticity, which is how our brains and our neural pathways work. And we know the research is really clear now that our brains can rewire, mainly for survival, so that we get a stress response to tell us to keep out of situations. It's very primitive, as Ken said, response. That might be great if you're hunting down woolly mammoth, and no letters in the postbag to say that woolly mammoths existed before humans, please. I do know that. I'm just using it as an example. But things like not wanting to go into the office, not wanting to go into a crowd of people, those are things that can really, really hold you back. And I think why it matters in the therapist room is that clients may struggle to recognize these experiences as a trauma, and they might downplay them. And I think one of the key things we could do as therapists is hold a space, and really tune in, empathically attune in, and listen to the stories or the narratives that may have been minimized elsewhere. How many times, Ken, as neurodivergent people, have we been told, oh, you used to have to try harder, oh, you make it a mountain out of a molehill, or it's just because you're lazy. If I hear that again, I'll pull my hair out. But those are the kind of things, those are the kind of narratives that people hear. And what happens is, Ken, as you say, you internalize them. So certainly I went to my first trainings thinking I was just a bit thick, and I was expecting the same thing to happen again, and I know that was your experience.
Yeah, and if you think about it, it's horrific because we end up labeling ourselves. I'm not very academic. That was a label I carried for a while. Because it was somebody else's values or the treatment of me from the past that made me develop that self-concept, which was a false self-concept. And you mentioned, maybe a client would not see it as linking to trauma, and I guess that's not a client's job, and I agree with you. It's not. But we as therapists, we need to understand it because we've got to make that connection to be able to work with that person fully and in the correct way within the moment. And of course, we can't really go into, you've already said, holding that space and how important that is. We can't go deep into how to work with trauma. It's a big topic. I mean, the course we put on is many hours of learning to be able to understand what to look for, how to work with that. But what we can share is hold the space and be kind and empathic and listen. And secondly, use curiosity, not correction with your client when they're presenting. And you may hear a client diminishing or dismissing it. And I certainly can recognize that, oh, but I grew up in a different time. It was different in schools, those, and what you're going to do, that was just how it was just then. And it's almost a way of taking that trauma and packaging it up in a, well, nothing can do, and putting it one side, when it is still very real with that person. And if we are working with curiosity, we can explore that deeper. If we do have a client who maybe dismisses their suffering or pushes that to one side with a, well, it wasn't really that bad, we can recognize it for what it really is and reframe it in the moment and be there empathically for that person now. Because at the time, that the trauma is being written from a stressful or difficult situation, or a number of difficult situations, there's the whole point is that there is a lack of seeing that person, understanding that person, and being empathic with that person. You speak of the tutor holding up your work in front of the whole class. Rory, that is abusive. It just is. It is abuse. When we look at it through these eyes, through this lens, it is abusive. And there was no compassion, kindness, and understanding of who you were or what you might have been going through in that moment. And very often these events can slip away without any empathic surround. So when it is brought back by a client in our sessions, just being curious, surrounding them with that love of a different kind for what they have gone through, I think is a good path for working with everyday trauma, Rory.
Yeah, absolutely. As is being alert to developmental timing. So an event that happens to a 5-year-old may be very differently experienced than someone who's 15 or someone who's 50. And I will go back to that original quote by Judith Herman, who I quote in the trauma-informed practice course. She said, "Trauma isn't defined by the event itself." So people could go through horrendous events and not have any trauma symptoms at all. But it's a subjective experience of it. So what we're looking for is the impact, not the story. And I think it comes to what we've always said in the podcast through the last 10 years, Ken, the music behind the words. So when people are talking about what's going on for them, it's not actually the story, it's the emotion that's conveyed in that story that can give us a clue, and it's only a clue, into its impact. And it's then that we use curiosity to be able to kind of explore that very gently with the client and see where they are with them. And it's not for us to say, you have post-traumatic stress. We're not saying, I'm sure there might be some people listening who are psychiatrists, but if someone goes to a therapy session, you went for therapy, not for psychologist assessment, and also body-based symptoms. So, one of the things we know where people have a trauma response is there's a visceral feeling in the body. It could be shortness of breath. It could be heart beating. Could even be the legs starting to, I've worked with clients where they've been talking about a situation and their feet have been running. They've been sat on the chair, but their legs have been in a running mode. And you can bet your bottom dollar that when you've asked when they told you what's happened, they said, I ran away. And they're actually playing that out in the therapy room. So it's very, very important that we don't adopt, we adopt a non-pathologizing stance. In other words, we don't diagnose. We don't come across as experts. We just work with the client, work with what they've got, and give them the space. I would say, as a kind of final observation, we give them the space for them to speak about what's going on without the usual dismissals or minimization they may get when they're talking to their friends or their families or at work. We hold that space for them, Ken.
Thank you for bringing this topic. What can you do listening to this? Well, two things. Train in trauma practice. Really, it's trauma is presenting in the therapy room all the time. There are hundreds of trauma courses out there. We have one too, counsellingtutor.com for that. And go and download the handout, Everyday Trauma, a Guide for Counsellors. This one is beautifully referenced, by the way. So at the bottom, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 references that kind of cover what we've spoken about today, that you can delve much deeper into it. It's the handout. It's free. You can get it by going to counsellingtutor.com. Click on the podcast tab, search for episode 341, that's today's episode, and it's right there on the page. You can just download that, and that's the handout, Everyday Trauma, a Guide for Counsellors. And that is today's ethical, sustainable practice. And as we kind of move out of ethical, sustainable practice into practice matters, where we bring guests on that have specialist information in certain areas. And Rory, you've introduced it already. It's Ellie Finch and Griffin, and their lecture, Working with Parents of Children with Disabilities or Complex Medical Conditions.
Yes, I was so happy to catch up with a regular person on the podcast, Ellie Finch. We've heard from her before. And Dr. Griffin, someone new to us who's bringing so much insight into something, Ken, that I know has touched both of our lives, and that's, parents of children with disabilities or complex medical conditions. And I share a little bit of my experience of this, certainly with my grandson. Ellie Finch and Griffin have done a fantastic lecture on this. I caught up with them, and this is what they had to say about it.
Practice Matters is proudly sponsored by the Counsellor CPD Library. To access top quality, relevant continuing professional development for your practice that you can do at a time that suits you, and all for less than the price of a cup of coffee, visit counsellingtutor.com.
I'm joined by a familiar voice, Ellie Finch, a frequent guest on the podcast, and she's brought along her colleague, Griffin. Together, they will share insights from a new lecture added to the Counsellor CPD Library. The title, Working with Parents of Children with Disabilities, Complex Medical Conditions and Special Educational Needs. We'll explore the challenges, emotional landscape and the supportive strategies counsellors can bring to working with clients within this group. So welcome, Ellie and Joe.
Hi, Rory. Thanks for having us.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
And as I said in the introduction at the beginning of the podcast, we all share a connection. I am the grandfather of a child who has what would be classed as high support needs because of his autism. And I know that you are parent carers yourself. And I know from my experience in our family just how much support and how much challenge, shall we say, that caring for a child with special educational needs or specific disabilities can bring. So let's just start with the idea of the small t trauma, the idea that everyday stressors can show up, how they can show up for parent carers. So, Ellie, what's your take? What's your take on this?
So because we often think about trauma as being this, what you could describe as a big T trauma. Some big event has happened, and it's very clearly this traumatic event that can cause all sorts of difficulties to the person who's experienced it. And I think what we wanted to highlight really is that parent carers can experience these sort of cumulative small t traumas that have a similar effect and impact, and they might be missed, they might not be understood, even actually by sometimes the parent carer themselves might not really notice that these are accumulating and occurring and the impact on them. And as therapists, we can, being aware of that is really helpful.
Absolutely. Joanna, how might these present for carers? How may a therapist think, well, there may be some trauma there with this particular client?
I think one of the kind of key things about trauma, and particularly thinking about the small t trauma, is generally when difficulties come along, humans are quite adaptable. We kind of, over time, we adapt, we get used to it, and then we come back to, I think it's called hedonic adaptation. We go back to our kind of normal functioning. But the key for parent carers is often there's no time to recover. You're kind of lurching from one small t to the next small t. And these may seem quite small to the outside world. I'm just thinking of examples where you're chasing up an appointment for your child, or a report has got lost. Now, from the professional's point of view, that might seem quite minor. Yes, it's frustrating, but it might seem quite minor. But when you put it in the context of this constant fighting, things happening, things going wrong, things being difficult, you not knowing what to do, where to go for support, without this time to recover, this cumulative effect, I think that's where you can see it really builds up, where people may seem very burnt out, they may be very angry, they may withdraw. So sometimes parents will withdraw from services because sometimes it's just too stressful, that kind of interacting. And also professionals may see parents that are angry. And that's why we wanted to kind of highlight that sometimes people that may be seen as difficult parents are actually traumatized parents.
Yeah, I would totally agree. And without speaking on behalf of my daughter, I can say that she has had to be very, I think the word strident in getting the help that my grandson needs, and raised voices and frank exchanges of views seem to be the order of the day, and it does have an impact. So, Ellie, as professionals, acting compassionately but being realistic, how do we support families navigating this ongoing stress and trauma that Joanna has really clearly outlined?
I think listening to podcasts like this, doing the training, can really help, just raising your awareness. Looking at forums, and there's lots of spaces online where that support and advocate for parent carers. And I think we in our therapeutic work, I think it's thinking about that there might be some particular needs that parent carers have that might be different from other clients you might have. And ones that we identify in the training are things like a flexibility of service. So as parent carers, we have lots of appointments for our children they can happen all of a sudden, and we need to change our therapy appointments. That having that flexibility of service and provision, not penalising parent carers for needing to change an appointment time or not being able to attend at the last minute. And obviously we have boundaries as therapists, and that's and contracts, and so it's sort of working with both those things as a bit of a tension. From this is from Joe's research, so Joe can just pitch in, but I know that Joe, through talking with parent carers, identified that they might struggle with homework kind of tasks and things like that, because there's just no time. Like you said earlier, we're dealing with a lot. Parent carers are dealing with a lot, and I think also this, through the case studies that we talk about in the training, I think it's really clear that often parent carers need practical support, maybe signposting, and alongside the therapeutic emotional support that we offer as therapists. And I think that needs to not be forgotten within the work, because unless some of the practical stuff gets addressed, then it's very hard to address the emotional things as well.
Yeah, and I guess being trauma informed is an essential when working with this client group.
Absolutely.
Understanding trauma. Joe, sometimes there's a bit of an elephant in the room, isn't there? From my experience of working with parent carers, there's something unspoken sometimes about fear of the child's death or how they will be looked after or supported when maybe the parent is too old to or infirm to offer that support. How do we make space to talk about this honestly?
I think that's such an important point to raise. And I think talking to any parent carers, that kind of question of who will look after them when I'm gone is massive. But of course, also there's the difficulty of some parents knowing that their child is going to die before them. And that's also very, very difficult. And I think having that space in therapy to talk about this perhaps will be the only place a parent feels safe to talk about these things that are really, really difficult, really painful. And I think sometimes there's also this tension of, if you talk about things that are difficult, it feels like you're being disloyal to your child, but also things need to be said. And I think therapeutic space is a really precious place for parents to take these difficulties. And I think, having spoken to parent carers who had counselling, what they found also helpful was not only having space to talk about this, but talking to a professional that knew something about the SEND world, special educational needs and disability world. Because for some people that had counsellors that had no awareness of this, the kind of counsellor's shock of how unhelpful sometimes systems could be wasn't supportive.
Yes.
So I think there is a real kind of onus on professionals to get a bit more familiar with what the challenges may be with dealing with the different systems, health, education and social care, and that kind of lack of support. So, yeah, I think having a space that's empowering and that's informed, where people are respected and treated as equals, because that's not always the experience dealing with different support services. These are all really, really key things that therapy can offer.
Yes, absolutely. And I guess that, by people viewing your lecture, that they're going to get an insight into that. I had a look over the lecture today. It really is comprehensive and very informative. I learned a few things, which is always a joy when you can watch the lecture and think, I didn't realise that. I've learned a few things. And I think you're right. I think that the parent carers are, to some extent, overlooked in a lot of ways. Certainly, my experience of my own family navigating my grandson's journey through life, things haven't been very smooth. There's been more, shall we say, frank exchanges of views than there have been. Yes, we could do that. That's no problem. There have been a lot of people who've been very helpful, but there have been, in one case, and I'm sure my daughter won't mind me remarking on this, at one point my daughter actually knew the law better than a professional that she was working with. And
I can believe it.
Yeah, doesn't surprise me at all.
Yes, and at one point my daughter said, the professional said, "So what are you going to do now?" And she said, "I'm going to apply for your job." My daughter's a wonderful, very well accomplished woman, and a fierce advocate for my grandson, thankfully we've got him in a position where he's very well supported. And it's interesting. I find myself talking more about my own personal life than maybe I would do on other interviews, and that's the real impact of being a carer. Obviously, when we have my grandson, we are his carers for that time when we have him. I guess one of the things that sometimes, alongside things like talking about a child's death or talking about maybe the inconvenience that the child brings in terms of having to put in systems in place to be able to support them. Sometimes I think that clients may discuss the loss of a possible future the child will have. I know when my wife was pregnant, we would often sit in bed talking to the Fred the Bump, as we called it. It happened to be a girl, but there we go. We called it Fred, and wondering what this child had become. And I guess that sometimes there is a loss of the fantasy, Ellie, that parents may have about how they imagine their child's future to be.
Yeah, it makes me think about there's a famous kind of it's like a poem or a kind of like it's called Welcome to Holland, and it's given out a lot to parents when they might get a diagnosis. I remember somehow getting a copy of it somehow when we first when our daughter was first diagnosed when she was really little, and there's critiques of this kind of poem, I feel like I want to call it a poem, but it's talking about you think you're on a trip to Italy and you're expecting Italy and all the things that Italy brings. Pizza and whatever, and you realize when you get off the plane that you've actually arrived in Holland, and you might be a bit shocked by that, and you weren't expecting that, but actually Holland has daffodils and lots of bikes, and so it's about sort of there's this kind of positive framework to it, but also acknowledging the shock and the sort of having to get used to not being where you think you're going to be. I think that's it really, that kind of adjustment and acknowledging the painfulness in that, but also that there are potential positives within it without kind of being, what's that word, that toxic kind of positivity around it. Like,
yes.
Oh, you're supposed to be some kind of amazing super parent now, and you're supposed to always see the positives in this. But I think, just my personal experience, sometimes I can be like, wow, I've just really advocated, thinking, I identify with your daughter. I've done a lot of strong advocacy, which makes me actually feel quite empowered sometimes. But sometimes you feel like you're fighting against a brick wall. And I think just going back to what you said something about how children. You said something, and it was, I think, well-meaning, like this. Children could be an inconvenience. And I think actually that makes me think about the social element of what we're dealing with here. The social, the impact of our culture and society and how it functions and how or not functions, and how our services don't function. And actually, our children would be. We wouldn't be using that word, I think, because if services, and we don't have to use that word, but services working better to support these families and these children, these parents, would mean that we'd all be freer to be able to recognise the positives in our life. And I think that is really important to remember.
Definitely, I would really agree with that. It's sometimes the look of others, the stigma and the views of society that actually puts more pressure on parents and children, and that it's really, really difficult. And I just also wanted to go back to this the positivity, because I think it's so important for professionals to hold on to this idea that there can be post-traumatic growth type things. Certainly my life, whilst shocking and traumatic and has been horrendous, is richer, definitely, and has led to certain, career paths for me, and a greater understanding. And people often talk about greater tolerance and acceptance and wanting to make society more tolerant and accepting. But I think it's so important where that's introduced in a parent carer's journey, because if you say something as a professional like that to someone early on in their journey, it could land really, really badly, as you said, Ellie, that kind of putting on a toxic positivity and expectation.
Yeah.
But I think professionals could hold it in mind that at a point down the line, when someone's gone through the work, gone through processing everything, then knowing that that's there, I think can be helpful. And one of the papers that we refer to in the presentation is about embracing this paradox that you can feel traumatized and feel despair and loss, but you can also find this hope and joy in seeing your child achieve something you never thought they'd achieve.
Yes.
And it's something about holding that tension, that oscillation that professionals will need to, without actually kind of putting pressure or blame or shame on parents for not feeling certain things.
And you talk about in the lecture, I found it fascinating, inch stones as opposed to, and it's certainly something that resonated with me. Joanna, just want to kind of tell us what that means in what is an inch stone?
So this was a quote from one of the parents that I interviewed. They talked about how they'd learned to, instead of celebrating the milestones that most people talk about with their children, you're celebrating the inch stones, because you're really seeing what's been difficult for your child, but perhaps with your support or just part of their development, they've learned to do something that you didn't think was going to be possible, and just how powerful that can be. But obviously, if you then share it with other parents of non-disabled children, it can seem very minor. But I think with other parent carers, they can often really get that.
Yeah,
that it's a massive thing, a massive achievement, and to be celebrated and is joyful.
It is, and socks are an inch stone in our house. So we will watch in awe as my grandson pops his socks on, as if he's literally, cracked the atom or worked out cold fusion or something like that. And there's so much joy in that, which actually I guess brings me to my next question. I know from my experience that we get, all our family get deep joy out of our grandson doing little things like he talks to the birds in the air, and he'll sing at the flowers, and he'll just dance around, and just to see him do that is a great joy. And sometimes I guess when you explain that to people who are not carers, they may say, "Oh, that's very nice," and then wander off. I think it's something that only probably parent carers can get. But it is very, very powerful. And what are some of the positive aspects of this that can, Ellie, emerge in the therapy room when we are celebrating those inch stones?
I think they come up like in that very sort of. I think it is like what Joe was saying earlier, like looking out for the moments, looking out for the time when looking at the strengths of the family and the parent carer and the things that would never exist in their lives that are positive, if their child wasn't disabled or had special needs. I'm trying to think of examples and thinking about, my own experience here. But I think just maybe there's a time and a place for taking someone to memories that are positive or experiences that are positive. I was just smiling with when you were talking about your grandson there, because, my daughter started singing recently, and if your client mentions something like that, that's something, like Joe said, to hold on to and maybe remind them of when they've forgotten how amazing that was.
And so precious. And I was thinking of a parent carer that I researched, in my research, and she was saying, I prefer my son's point of view about things.
Yes.
Just loving throwing leaves in the air, or refusing to wear a silly costume for school. There's something quite freeing about that, and I really like that. We learn and grow as our children do as well.
Yes. Yeah. And I think sometimes, if we talk about the joy, and it's different for everybody, of course it is, but I think unless you've got you're attuned to why that joy is so powerful, it's easy for an opportunity in therapy to be missed. So somebody talking about, well, my child's put their socks on today. That was like, oh, it's great. Let's move on to something else. But being attuned to a parent carer and understanding, the needs, which this lecture really does speak to, can help a therapist really hear what the client's saying. I think that's what I'm getting to here. Someone's put the socks on. Well, by understanding the landscape of working with parent carers and children with disabilities, realising that just isn't an ordinary day at the office. That is whoopee-doo,
Yeah.
Let's get the camera out and take some pictures of this. Let's share it amongst the family and talk about it when we meet.
I think you're right. I think it's about understanding the layers. I sort of think of it as layers and peeling back the layers so that of understanding. And I think as a parent carer, my experience as well is that all the layers of my experience and my experiences to come aren't always visible to me even. My daughter is, preteen, and I'm going to be going through teenage years and transitions and to services and schools. And I think, understanding these many layers that parent carers experience is so important. And it's hard, it's challenging, even as a parent carer myself and someone who, specializes in working with parent carers, I don't always get that. So it's a challenge for us.
Yes.
And I just thinking if I could just add in as well about the complexity, because we do talk about this in the presentation, but I think it's so important, this complexity that you can feel a joy, you may also feel a sadness all at the same time. And that sometimes it's unpacking that and knowing that you can feel happy and sad at the same time, and kind of making sense of that a little bit more in the therapy that's really helpful.
Yeah, you can oscillate between the two feelings and they're not exclusive. You can hold them together.
At the same time,
Same time.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what are your hopes for people who are watching this lecture? What do you hope as the people who deliver the lecture that people will take away, the watcher or the listener will take away?
I hope people like, and I think even listening to this podcast is going to be helpful for people, but I think hopefully people will come away with a greater understanding of parent carer experience and how to support them in a therapeutic context.
I think also about just trying to become a little bit more aware about the landscape that parent carers are dealing with in terms of these different systems, the health, education and social care, and how complex that can be. I think also about identifying the small T trauma is really, really important.
Working with parents of children with disabilities, complex medical conditions and special educational needs is available now in the Counsellor CPD library. It just remains for me to say, Ellie Finch and Joe Griffin, thank you so much for joining us.
Massive thank you to Ellie, Joe, and of course to you, Rory, for reaching out and holding those all-important discussions. As already mentioned, that lecture is available in our Counsellor CPD library. If you're a member, log in. It's there for you. If you're not a member, go to counsellingtutor.com. All the information is there on the products page, and you can join that library for less than the price of a cup of coffee for two per month. There it is. So that is today's Practice Matters. We now move into Student Services. Student Services is sponsored by Counselling Skills Academy. Can't tell you how many times Rory and I have heard counselling students say that learning skills and knowing that they're using them effectively is really, really challenging. The reason for this is because we don't get to see another counsellor using skills in a real live session. In reality, this means that we're asked to learn something that we can never see demonstrated in a real setting, and it's no wonder that many of us are left feeling unsure. If you want to see counselling skills used in real sessions by qualified therapists, so this is real sessions, real presentations, and real use of skills, then go to counsellingskillsacademy.com. There's some free videos on skills, including a full live session that you can have a look at. Gain the competence and the confidence of knowing you're using your counselling skills effectively. Just visit counselingskillsacademy.com. In student services, we're looking to you, your students, on your formal journey to become a counsellor, or maybe to just gain some counselling skills and knowledge to work with in your current career. And you know, when we look at this, the journey to become a counsellor, we hope that we're going to start and we're going to do the first bit and we're going to love it, and then we're going to apply for the second part of the course, and then we're just going to get automatically accepted on that and go forward. But it can be a bit tougher than that at times, because I think colleges, universities, they sometimes have caps on how many people they can take in, and you may find yourself studying at an institution and then looking to go on the next stage of that course and getting rejected, and that can be hard to take, and it's more common than you think, and I think it deserves talking about, Rory.
Yeah, absolutely, Ken. And I think you've hit the nail. I think you've hit the nail on the head. In that, some reasons for rejection is that the courses are capped. There'll be so many on a counselling course, and you know, some institutions aren't running them anymore, which means there's a high demand, and obviously some people are going to be disappointed. Interestingly enough, this topic came up in our Facebook group recently, and a person posted, if you want to join our Facebook group, you probably know by now if you're a regular listener, just go to Facebook, put Counselling Tutor in, and you'll find us. And there's lots of people who came and tried to share their views on a poster who had exactly this experience, that they'd been rejected for a course. And I think the word rejection is such a hard word, doesn't it? It's the harshest of word, rejected. It's so weighted in, you're not good enough, you're not coming in, you know, you failed. I mean, just one word it can be so powerful. And a lot of people spoke very eloquently about their experiences of not being able to get on courses. And quite interestingly, Ken, a lot of it was very positive, because after the initial shock and feeling quite down about not being able to progress, what happened was there was for some a period of introspection where they asked themselves some questions, and maybe they had to change a few things about themselves, maybe go for some therapy, or just you know, look at the feedback and try to understand what the tutor saw, which maybe they didn't see in themselves. Because sometimes it's not just about course numbers. You know, sometimes tutors say, well, we don't think you're ready to work, to go into level 4. But a lot of people who are offering support, after they'd done some personal kind of development, actually found that the process sent them in a different direction. And some applied to other courses and were successful, and found the other course far better than the courses they'd been on previously. And more to the point, other people just took some time out to do some personal work and came back with a really different perspective. And I thought it was really heartening to see how people had taken this terrible word, rejection, and actually really turned it into a positive in the end.
Yeah. Oh, very much so. And I think on this topic, we start at why someone might not get that progression through to the next course, let's call it. Yeah. So we've mentioned that the numbers are capped, and I think it's important to say why they are capped. So we have the awarding bodies will actually stipulate how many people can be in a class at various levels, and it goes down. So if you take a level 3, you can have a lot of people in that class. When you're up at level 4 and 5, it's a lot less people that can be in that class per tutor holding those people, because of course the level of work is a lot deeper at that level. So if you've got 30 people on a level 3 and they all want to go on a level 4, and that level 4 is is capped at 20 people. I'm just using random numbers here. Well, 10 people can't go forward, and so that is the reasons for it. Also, sometimes, as you mentioned, Rory, the learning institution may not provide progression. They may only offer a certain level, and then you may need to go to another learning institution where you're kind of starting from scratch to try and knock on that door. They may have their own internal progression, and it may look like it's more difficult to progress. So sometimes it's not about you as the student. Sometimes it just is that the course is full, or that the provision isn't there. And it's worth asking why. So if you do apply for a certain level of course and you do get that course rejection, that horrible word, get feedback. Why? And look at that feedback. And then there is that reflective process, Rory, as you've mentioned before, of maybe there's an opportunity to grow through this and learn through this. Or maybe it was just that the course was full and we go knock on another door. And for me, the solution of this is based in your why. Mm-hmm. So when you decided, you know what, I want to be a therapist. It's a long study journey. It's arduous, as we've mentioned many times. And if you're going through the study journey, you're going to know that by now. You're doing massive personal development, plus you're called on to meet the academic criteria as well. It's a tough old journey. But when your why is strong enough, it's the why that brings you through. It is your why. I'm doing this because X. In my case, I had a difficulty in my journey. I was in the darkness. Somebody put their hand into the light, from the light, and helped me out of that. And I wanted to do the same for others. So that was my why. And when that why is strong enough, it helps you face the resistance that is going to come anyway from the student journey. It's going to shake you up and shake you about. It's kind of designed to do that. And maybe not getting progression might just be part of that resistance. Do you have what it takes to go, okay, then it's not going to be this learning institution, it's going to be another one. Or I'm going to go away from this learning institution, I'm going to implement what they have suggested, might be the reasons why I was rejected, and I'm going back, and their next intake I'm applying again and again and again. And I'm going to get in there, that positive mindset of this is going to happen. And if your why is strong enough, you'll find the how through that. Can be hard to get any kind of rejection. So self-care, looking at how you can make yourself feel okay about that. And you mentioned the Facebook group, Rory. I think that's a great place to put something like that, because it can feel, this is just me. I've been singled out here, and it's not. There are many who have faced this and have overcome it and gone through it and come out on the other side. There are many practicing therapists who were refused progression on a course at some stage. So it happens. Don't take it too personally, and if you can, use it as an opportunity for growth and development, Rory.
Yeah, absolutely. And the reality is that there can be a number of reasons why you don't progress. One could be things, that old Joe Harvey window situation where people, others can see in you something that might cause you some difficulties, but you can't see it yourself. It can be, clash of personalities with the tutor. That does happen. Course numbers. In some cases, it can be that the tutor doesn't think the institution has the support mechanisms to support someone with specific learning difficulties or challenges, shall we say. And I'm known of one or two institutions that offer no kind of support for those who are doing diploma courses. Anything above certificate, they put a lot of personal tuition in for you to go to the library, and you could there'd be people there who'd help you. But when you got to higher education, which a diploma technically is certainly in England, slightly different in Scotland, there was no support in place, and it would have just been unfair to take someone on. So if you are listening to this and you're saying Rory and Ken are really talking about me, what I would say is don't give up hope. If your why is strong enough, if you really believe that you can be a therapist, then keep going, find another institution or look at the feedback. And first of all, look at the feedback and say, well, is that fair feedback? Someone might just be someone gives you feedback, doesn't actually mean it's true. That's the first thing. Are other people telling you the same thing? If a number of people give you the same feedback, maybe it's something you need to take notice of. And, if it's really in your heart and you really want to help people, just keep going. And I'll guarantee you that if you do, and when you qualify, you'll realize exactly what a disappointing yet developmental experience not being given an opportunity to go on the courses. Because, I'm a great fan of the philosopher Nietzsche, and I'm probably misquoting him here, but he said, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And I'm a great believer in that. I think that by keep pushing forward, you get there eventually. And that's certainly mine and your experiences, Ken, by the sound of it. So
it is.
Don't give up hope.
Yeah. And just a final thought on this. I want to go to why you are hearing Rory and I in your ear, or watching us on YouTube, wherever you choose to kind of consume your podcast. You're doing it, you're listening to us because, over a decade ago, Rory and I were teaching together, and we recognized that within certain students struggled with the academic side. And I know that some people are refused progression because of the academic side of counseling. And we also recognize that so often somebody going in to study counseling might be doing so later in life. It's unusual. It's not unheard of, but it's unusual that you might graduate school and say, I want to become a counsellor, and go straight to uni or college to become a counsellor. Usually we go out, we live some life, and that may be many decades, and then the life kind of path guides us to wanting to be a helper and a counsellor or a psychotherapist, and then we come into training. And of course, as we come into training, we're not well versed in academic writing and how that is now, because it's certainly changed over the years, and awarding bodies have criteria that need to be met. And what Rory and I saw was really capable, empathic counselors who, within observed skill sessions, were just made to be counselors, but struggled understanding and writing out the academic side of what it takes, because you've got to do maybe some exams, maybe some portfolios, whatever the work is you have to hand in. And it was because of that Rory and I started Counselling Tutor, and it was for students only, and it was to help with those academic bits and bobs. And on counsellingtutor.com, our website, if you go to there and just click on the student section and scroll down a little bit, there is looks like a little search engine, looks like a little Google search box on the student page, counsellingtutor.com. Go to that and type in anything that you might be covering in your lessons, and you're going to find our easy to understand, taking the technical jargon and putting it into plain English examples of that. That's what we started off doing. And then, of course, that became the student library, where we started making lectures, taking the complex theory and making it easy to understand. So the very basis of Counselling Tutor was because of students struggling to progress because of that academic side. And I know we've shared the journey with over 40,000 students now, Rory. It's a lot, isn't it? Counselling student library. So and also in that student library, there's an academic writing course which is made by a counsellor who teaches counselling, saying this is how they ask the questions, this is how you answer them. I think it's the golden key within there. So if you are struggling with the academic side of things, there is help. There's free help on our YouTube channel, through our podcast, and on our website. Or if you're up for it, there's the student library, which is paid access, but it's a lot more in-depth help on the academic side of things. Wow. I suppose there's a number of reasons for that. I'm going to say rejection and put it in inverted commas. There you go. Side of things, but it can be an opportunity for growth. We are delighted that you joined us today. This has been episode 341 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast.
Yes, and we started off with ethical, sustainable practice and discussed everyday trauma, where we outlined that trauma doesn't have to be a capital T. It's about perception and people's ability to cope. And don't forget, there's a free handout there. Go to counsellingtutor.com. Click the podcast tab, episode 341, and that handout is available for you to download. On to Practice Matters, an interview with Ellie Finch and Dr. Griffin on their lecture, Working with Parents of Children with Disabilities, Complex Medical Conditions, Special Educational Needs. A great conversation, and one I think that will be resonant with a lot of the people who listen to this podcast. And then finally, on to Student Services. Not progressing. How do we handle not moving on to the next course? Ken and myself had a discussion, and Ken shared some very, very helpful resources that might be useful if you are a person like myself and Ken who struggles academically with the writing and the putting together of academic papers. Finally, thank you so much for listening, for your shares, for your indulgence. Lots of people have listened to the podcast for a huge amount of time, and your comments, which means the world to us. So until next time we meet, stay grounded and stay safe.
Take the stress out of your counselling studies and get the support of Rory and I by joining us in the Counselling Study Resource. Counselling Study Resource, or CSR for short, is the world's most comprehensive assignment guidance and study support resource for students just like you of counselling and psychotherapy. See how Counselling Study Resource can help you. Visit counsellingtutor.com. That's counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode by visiting counsellingtutor.com.